Good morning, everyone. That was a terrific setup. Thank you, Mike, in terms of this. And as Mike said, I am sponsored by the Electric Power Research Institute. I worked there in the power industry for 20-some years. The last year and a half, I've been seconded to the World Economic Forum as a fellow in leading the North American efforts around this initiative I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm going to go through a little bit of an overview of the initiative, but a little bit of setup in terms of how this kind of relates to some of the goals you guys are working on in terms of net zero. And there's some opportunities, I think, for you guys to kind of get connected, not only with this initiative, but some of these net zero industrial clusters that are very likely in your region. So we're not doing Zoom, which is fantastic, but I'm going to do a not for Zoom poll. Just maybe a show of hands. How many of your companies actually have stated net zero goals? That's pretty good, okay. And then how many of you in your regions or within your companies are connected to regional industrial decarbonization clusters, hydrogen hubs, CCS hubs? How many of you are involved in those directly or indirectly in your companies? That's pretty good. Okay, looking through the roster, I think it's probably a lot more. I think there's a lot of folks that are in this room that may not quite be aware of some of the things that are happening even within your own companies, because within Europe and some of the global community that I'm going to talk about, there is a lot of interaction both in the tech side, but also on the industrial side. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. A little bit start with the challenges out there in terms of reaching net zero. What does net zero mean from a policy side? And then talk about this concept of a net zero industrial cluster. And then a little bit of our initiative, a little bit of what we're doing, and some examples for you to see. I think that always brings it home. And then some kind of key kind of advice or guidance in terms of how do you set up one of these within your region for success. So first, a little bit of a background, net zero. So this is some data from EPRI. EPRI has done a study which looks at what does it really take from an economic standpoint to reach net zero. And in the U.S., this is U.S. data. In the U.S., there's really two stated policy goals. One is a 50% reduction in CO2 by 2030, economy-wide, and then net zero by 2050. So you can see how that breaks out a little bit between industries. The blue line there shows the overall economy-wide sectors there, and you can kind of see where that slope is from where we are now around 2020 down to 2050. And then you can see some of the different sectors that kind of fit in there. So first off, you see the electric sector. The electric sector is where we're making the most headway. And you can look at that, you can see what progress we made going back to 2005 in the electric sector. Most of that is actually due not necessarily to renewables, which might be what folks would think offhand. Renewables are definitely a part of that carbon reduction, but it's really been driven by the switch from coal to natural gas. That's been a major change in the industry, and that has produced some significant reductions in CO2. And then you see beyond that, the concept is that as you clean up, as you decarbonize the energy supply, the electricity supply, you can then use that clean electricity to decarbonize other sectors of the economy. And the most obvious one is transportation, looking towards electric vehicles, for example, but also more public transportation, other types of transportation. So that's where you get the second tier of reductions on that chart. But then you see the hardest one out there is the industrial sector, and that's what we want to focus on today. That industrial sector is the one that is tougher for a lot of reasons. Here's some data that shows the global greenhouse gas footprint for the industrial sector. So about 30% globally of greenhouse gas emissions are from industry. And you can see how that breaks down. 80% of those are from oil, gas, steel, cement, aluminum, ammonia. And why are those hard to tackle? These are industrial processes. Sometimes these are very heat-intensive industrial processes. These are not just amenable necessarily to simple switch to electrification. In some cases, you may need to bring in things like hydrogen. Some industrial folks are actually thinking about things like small modular reactors to get the intense heat you need for some of these processes. So it's a combination of technology availability today and then the economics of the technologies that are available. So although there's solutions out there to decarbonize, they're not necessarily the most cost-effective or the most readily available today. So there's a big push to bring those technologies forward and to drive cost effectiveness. So a little bit kind of a backstep now into one of the mechanisms that we think is very viable, that folks are embracing in terms of getting at this industrial segment, is this concept of industrial clusters. What does that mean? Industrial clusters basically says that I'm going to look around in my region and I'm going to take a look to see what the industrial footprint is, what is the energy footprint, what is the electricity footprint, what is the jobs footprint, what's the policy look like in the region, and I'm going to see if we can get together as a region and we can establish decarbonization infrastructure that can be shared among different industries. That's a game changer. And that could even be between industries that are not in the same kind of boat at all. Cement, steel, for example, can get together for common infrastructure. It could also be even companies that are competitive, are getting together to figure out if it makes sense for them to chip in for common infrastructure for decarbonization. And by doing that, you do a couple things. One is you lower the economic, you lower the price of that. You also lower the risk of these big investments. Some of these are 10-year investments, 10-year kind of operations to kind of move into new infrastructure. And then overall, you want to take a look at and see how that plays in the region and how that plays in terms of your overall kind of job market, your economic situation. So this is really taking existing clusters that may be long-term and transforming them to be more economically viable and also to be more focused on decarbonization. I think it's a little bit easier to look at some examples than just to kind of look at the theoretical aspects. So one of the most advanced of these industrial clusters is in the UK, the HyNet cluster. I know the graphic's a little bit tough to see. I encourage you to Google HyNet. There's all kinds of information. I apologize for those of you that here in the audience have alternative web browsers besides Google. You may want to Bing it or whatever you want to do. But this there's videos on this. There's a lot of data. There's some really great maps in terms of this cluster. So what is HyNet? HyNet is an industrial region in the northwest of UK, as it says, around Liverpool and Manchester. Traditionally, it's been the seat of the economy there. They have everything from manufacturing, for steel, chemicals, cement, of course, shipping. And that region is looking to see how can they transform themselves? How can they transform themselves to this decarbonized economy? And how can they do it with not only preserving the jobs, preserving the benefits that they have in the region to the economy, but growing jobs, growing the economic viability of the region. So that's what they're focused on. So what is this infrastructure? I mentioned a couple times that the key to this is investing in common infrastructure to lower the risk for decarbonization. So there's two things that they've invested in this region. Both center around pipelines. The first is pipelines for CO2 removal. So having a pipeline that can take CO2 offtake directly from cement, for example, from steel facilities, and taking that offshore, where they have disposal facilities offshore. That's one. And the other is that they have a very big natural gas infrastructure in the region. So taking that natural gas infrastructure and those pipelines, introducing hydrogen into that system. In some cases blending, in some cases direct hydrogen to help with some of these industrial processes that may benefit from using hydrogen as a fuel source. So that's the mechanism that they have there. So the hydrogen and the CO2 pipeline together form the strategy where they can all chip in to make this decarbonization happen. The interesting thing about this region is there is a lot of play. There's a lot of ownership and pride in the whole region about this effort. So you have huge community support, you have government support, you have policy support, and dollars and infrastructure coming in to support this. So it's gotten to the point where everyone is behind this and really supporting the vision. So Mike touched on sustainability. This isn't all just about decarbonization. I mentioned several times it's about jobs, it's about economic benefit, and you can see they've actually quantified some significant economic and jobs benefit from this as well. Okay, Houston. So Houston's another great example. So I know I've actually talked to a few folks already since I got here, and I know there's a lot of folks that are Houston-based, or at least companies have a big presence in Houston. So that's looking at a U.S. example. Houston is, of course, very big in oil and gas, very big in petrochemical, very big in wind, actually, out in the western part of Texas. So kind of pulling those resources together, there's a group that is in Houston. H2 Houston is the organization that's driving this. They're actively competing for some of the federal dollars that are out there for clean hydrogen hubs, very competitive in that. And their vision is to transform some of the infrastructure around the oil and gas pipelines to do the same two things that HyNet was thinking about. One is to drive hydrogen infrastructure to all the industrial processes in the region, and also to take CO2 from both hydrogen production, but also for energy use, and utilize that and store that in some of the deep oil field wells and such that are in western Texas. So with that kind of investment in infrastructure, they can drive a lot of production of what we call blue hydrogen. I hate to use those colors, but basically the idea is in the short term that you can generate hydrogen using some of the gas infrastructure, and you take the CO2 that's used as part of that hydrogen generation, and that's what you'll sequester. And that becomes carbon neutral in terms of the overall process, and it's a very economically viable path, especially given the fact that in the region you already have many companies out there that are already producing hydrogen. You already have end users for hydrogen in the region, so there's a lot of support for that. And lastly, I think the kicker here, what's really novel for what Houston is doing, is that they intend to export a large amount of that hydrogen globally. So that really drives the economics in the region for Houston. And you already have international groups that are interested in buying that hydrogen. So this is something that's in development, that's happening, that is really economically viable for the region. Okay, so switch gears a little bit in terms of our initiative. So what are we doing about this? So as I mentioned, I'm a fellow at the forum. The World Economic Forum is like EPRI. It's a nonprofit. We're doing these initiatives kind of pro bono with the idea of getting as many of these industrial clusters started and launched globally as possible. We have a goal to get 100 of these industrial clusters moving and launched in the next 3 years. So that's a very ambitious goal, but we already have 17. We started this at COP26. We already have 17 of them signed up to our initiative and moving forward. What are we actually doing? There's really two aspects of what we're doing this initiative. The first is we're developing this community, and we're sharing lessons learned between the community members in terms of decarbonization practices, in terms of policy learnings, in terms of financial learnings, and we're doing that to accelerate the development of these clusters globally. So everyone's getting together 3 or 4 times a year. They're learning from each other. They're sharing insights, and that's really making progress viable. The other thing we're doing is we're working with new hubs, new clusters, to get them off the ground. One of the most difficult things to do as you set up one of these clusters is to establish the partnership, a viable partnership option. So we, as kind of an independent source, will come in, work in the communities, work in the region, and help to develop that original partnership. Take you through the process, get folks to start make commitments, develop the vision for what technologies you want to deploy in the region, and that's a big part of what we do. There's a lot of resources there. A lot of them are publicly available for the most part. There's some good reports in there that you can dig into if you want to learn more. So I touched on this a little bit, but I'll say we're focused on the 4 key aspects of developing one of these clusters or hubs: the partnerships, policy, informing policy, also kind of understanding if there's policy barriers or opportunities out there. Financing, I mentioned that there's a lot of federal money out there now to support this in the U.S. and other places, but you also have to match that with private funding. You have to make that sustainable. You have to make sure industry is supporting, because industry is eventually the one that's going to have to take over and foot the bill on this long term to make it sustainable. And then, of course, the technology. The technology, that's something that we're all here for. So I thought I'd just dig a little bit deeper into that. Well, the colors are awful on that slide. But there's really 4 pillars of the technology that you want to think about if you're going to set up one of these net zero industrial clusters. There's no right answer here. If you're going to think about one of these in your region, you really need to assess what's viable, what infrastructure you already have, what are some of the technical capabilities you may have. Do you have pipelines, for example? Do you have the ability to produce hydrogen? Do you have the end users at scale? But here's some of the 4 pillars you want to look at. Hydrogen, we talked about. Carbon capture, utilization, storage, another big mechanism. Direct electrification, renewable heat. Having a clean energy source can really help out a lot in terms of getting this going. And then circularity, efficiency, systemic efficiency. You have a unique opportunity with this concept to co-locate companies, to share process inputs and outputs between companies. And that's a game changer in terms of thinking about these types of processes. You can think about chemical parks, for example, where you're taking actual heat from one process and using that to drive another. Water is another great opportunity. You produce water and for manufacturing, for wastewater. Can you clean up that water and use that input as an input for electrolysis, for example? There's a lot of opportunities there. And for this group, overriding all this, of course, is IoT opportunities. Those aren't stated directly on this slide, but you can think about a couple of key opportunities. You're creating this brand new infrastructure. One of the key things in the IT side is modeling. And there's twofold opportunities around modeling. The first is as you set up one of these, you really need to model it extensively to understand how all these processes can work together, how to make it viable, what's the geographic kind of capacity, how's everything come together. So that's one opportunity. But as these get established, then you're really in the space of how do you optimize it. So things like digital twinning, things like using AI to figure out how to optimize the balances between these systems becomes critical. And you know, this is not only is a whole new way of thinking about things, but it's also cross-company, cross-industry. So there's also a level of infrastructure that's going to be needed that's going to be outside of the companies that are participating. And that's going to have some kind of a collaborative framework that's going to be part of the decision-making in terms of these processes, but it's also going to have its own security protocols and such that's going to have to be agreed on by the company. So a lot of opportunity there. And the last one I'll mention is data centers. I saw Mike had that up on his slide. We're seeing a lot of these companies these clusters are bringing in data centers as part of the cluster. And there's a lot of opportunity there for not only using some of this clean energy supply to drive the energy, to drive the data centers, but also things like water, where you may need a lot of water for cooling for data centers, for example. There's an opportunity to get some synergies with that as well. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears now. Just to wrap up, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned. So if you're interested in this, if you go back and you want to look to see what's happening in your region or what your company's involved in here, I'll just give you a couple takeaways in terms of some of the things that we're seeing out there in terms of lessons learned. The first is we have produced, this is our first year of doing this initiative, a very extensive what we call a playbook for these clusters. We have 13 of the industrial clusters kind of benchmarked in this report. It's publicly available. There's a link on the slide there for this. But what it does is it takes and benchmarks these industrial clusters from initiation all the way up to maturity. And it looks at these 4 different benchmarks that I talked about: partnership, policy, financing, technology, and gives you some very easy ways to kind of digest and kind of look to see what some of these clusters are doing around these parameters. So it's a great place to start. Again, go back to kind of lesson learned, focus on the partnership. The partnership, especially at the beginning, is the most important aspect of pulling it together, the most difficult. It's easy to get a group of folks in a room to start talking about this and to build within your community. It's a lot harder to get to the point where people are actually willing to make commitments and put money on the table and dollars and infrastructure on the table. It's a tough path, and there's some good insights in there in terms of how to go about that. And I'll just leave you with one last thought, and this is a lead into the panel that's going to follow. I know this is going to be something that's touched on, but leadership matters. So this is one of these out-of-the-box types of aspect that's something that's unique, probably in the mindset of your company, certainly probably within the mindset of a lot of the folks you'll be dealing with in your region. So it's really important to bring good leadership and good leadership teams to the table that recognize that change, that are willing to work across the aisles, not only across the divisions within your company, but also within the divisions of other companies within the community and within community groups themselves, and really engage in all fronts in this is really critical to success. So this is a kind of key factor here. Kind of have to get out of the compliance mentality. And a good example, I'll just give you one last example here that we see in setting these up. When you get down to the regional level, you're actually starting to talk to the plants. You're talking to the divisions in the region. The plants are super focused on the day-to-day operations, of course, optimization, bottom line, meeting regulatory requirements. This just blows the people away, and you come in and you talk about we're going to transform your region to be burning hydrogen in terms of gas, or bring electrification, whatever the big decarbonization infrastructure is that you're going to bring. So you really need some folks. Not only do you need folks that can think and kind of embrace that vision, but you also need sometimes some support from the corporate level, because a lot of times you at your corporate levels are going to have very ambitious decarbonization goals. You're going to have resources to drive this change, but you've got to bridge that gap between the folks that are in the region that are actually going to be doing the day-to-day kind of change management of this. And that's sometimes a difficult conversation, but one that you make sure you facilitate as you're thinking about this. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it back over to Mike. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.